Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jenelle Krishnamoorthy, Interim Vice President for Global Public Policy, Merck & Company, and Steve Morrison, Senior Vice President and Director, Global Health Policy Center, Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Thank you. Welcome, Jenelle. We're going to have a quick conversation here this afternoon about antimicrobial resistance and the impacts of COVID-19 and what does this all mean. Why don't you describe for us what's the scale and scope of the challenge to begin with in terms of antimicrobial resistance? Why do we need to care about this problem?
No, Steve, thank you for having me today, because I really look at this problem as kind of a silent killer. It's like the silent tsunami. We have, over 700,000 people are killed annually. And we have made some amazing advances in modern medicine. I mean, you think about the surgeries, the medicines, the prevention, everything that we have achieved. However, we know, especially talk about this pandemic, the secondary infections, or an infection that you get in the neonatal unit with your child, that can kill you. And unfortunately, what we're finding is as soon as an antibiotic is starting to be used, resistance starts, right? It starts to develop. Right. And unfortunately, we're at a time when new antibiotics are not keeping up with the resistance. And this is a complex issue. Unfortunately, it's not going to be one solution that's going to solve this problem. And that's why it really is going to take all of us, governments, academics, NGOs, experts, community leaders, to really get our arms around this so that we can all live prosperous lives and not be in a position where you're in the hospital and you hear there is no antibiotic. It's a hope and a prayer now.
Now, in the last several years, going back in the last 8 or 9 years, consciousness of this problem has increased dramatically. We've had leadership from like Dame Sally Davies in the UK as chief medical officer there at that time. She's now at Oxford carrying on this. We had leadership at the WHO. We had leadership within the US government. Under the Obama administration, this became a priority. There were policies pushed forward, regulatory changes, a whole consciousness, and people began to realize that, in fact, an estimated like 35,000 Americans die unnecessarily each year, and it's 3 million cases. So let's start with, what was the progress that we saw in terms of adherence to regimen, stewardship, regulatory reform, partnerships to get the pipeline back together with private industry? What were those gains? We'll talk about the COVID impact in a moment, but I want you to describe for us the changes that happened that were dramatic and profound in the last 8 years.
Yeah, Steve, a very good question. And I think, you're acknowledging that, you look 15 years ago or so, this was not on people's radar screens, right? So absolutely, there has been real awareness of this issue and that we need to do something. And the Obama administration put out an AMR action plan. We had in the United States, they about 10 years ago came up with some regulatory easements so that antibiotics would be able to come to the market. And as you said, most recently in the G7, they actually discussed how could we have real commitments on AMR. And I think we have seen across the country and the globe where stewardship and how can we ensure that the right antibiotic is used for the right amount of time, which of course means diagnostics plays a huge role here in how to attack this problem. The one area where we are still needing the pull through, because you're exactly right. It's from this end here where we're looking at the research and development that is so critical that needs to be occurring all the way through getting a new antibiotic to market. And that is where we have seen just a dearth of, there hasn't been the action. So that unfortunately, Merck is one of a few companies that has been investing in discovery and development over the past 80 years. But this is going to take more companies, private, public sector coming together. And I'd say another piece of action, which has been really positive, Steve, is several companies came together, about 19, including Merck and with the Wellcome Trust and others, to develop an innovation fund. And this fund is a $1 billion fund to come up with 2 to 3, hopefully, or 4 novel antibiotics by 2030. This is a short-term, Band-Aid, I'd say, until it gives time for the G7 and countries around the world to actually act on these plans to address the whole continuum of the issue.
Now, I know that when we look at why is there a weak pipeline? Why has there been a weak pipeline? People have focused on there's barriers in terms of getting clinical trials underway. There's oftentimes not been the business case. There's been a couple of very conspicuous cases where companies went out and invested $150 million, got the product to market, sales were not there. So trying to figure out the market. Then there's been a lack of diversity in the pipeline itself that we've needed to correct. So those problems we've faced, but there's been, it seems to me, progress in trying to do more triaging. In other words, trying to get industry talking about prioritizing candidates.
Right.
There's been more action taken to try and have coordinated clinical field trials.
Right.
And then trying to innovate on the payment mechanism so that we have more assurance of the market and closer partnerships. Say a few words about those innovations, which seem very fundamental to changing the outlook among folks like yourself who are trying to make a judgment around, we're a commercial enterprise. We've got to keep an eye on what really is going to be successful over the long term.
That's right. That's right. No, that's an excellent observation and a very good question here. And I think, let me add to a lot of the work that's been done, and you put a finer point on it, where, many governments have invested to kind of de-risk funding of our small biotechs, right? To do the research and development.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what we're finding, and you were discussing this, there's this valley of death that we, have termed the phrase, because you're saying when you then are coming to market, getting back to the importance of only use this jewel at the right time, at the right place, that doesn't quite work with your return on investment, right? And so there have been several proposals. I know the Pasteur Act here in the United States, looking at maybe a Netflix subscription model. I know other in the UK looking at a fund as well. And so, I think people are trying to think about, again, how do you make it that you go from the research and that it makes it makes sense to invest and then bring to market. But again, you do not want people prescribing this overly. You actually want them to sit on the shelves. And that's a very different business case to make. And so that is where, again, it needs to take all of us to come up with solutions so that more people want to get into this field, which is a public health need, right? Like we have to do this.
Let's talk for a moment about the mixed impacts of COVID when we're now in the 19th month, right? It seems to me that COVID has cut in a number of directions. On the one hand, you have this enormous pool of patients living with experiencing COVID-19, and there has there's a huge risk of misuse and overprescription of antibiotics. This is a virus, but there's also infection, bacterial infections. It should not be surprising that there's that risk. There's risk of regression in practices. There's also the fact that this crisis takes our eye off of the ball in some ways, right? We've had to make all sorts, we've had to postpone or delay all sorts of very important things in medicine and in practice. And this may be one of those too. So those are the two big, it seems, risk factors I'd like you to talk about. But there's also the gains that in the course of this pandemic, we have changed and innovated significantly on vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, in forming these partnerships between industry and government, prioritizing candidates, organizing the clinical trials better, organizing the payment mechanisms better. So there are models there, it seems to me, coming out of COVID that have direct application and value for antimicrobial resistance. So just we've got a few minutes left to sort of hear your thoughts on the impact. This is obviously a very profound moment in our history, and it has huge implications for antimicrobial resistance.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think with COVID-19, the CDC has, reported there has been nearly 45% increase of hospital-acquired infections related to all the ventilation use, all the people on ventilators, right?
Yeah.
And so this is, and all the individuals that are now in hospitals due to COVID-19, over 29% have multi-drug resistant infections at this moment. I think you are correct there are some opportunities, but I think there's some challenges. Again, with the global pandemic, I believe, again, there's a real awareness that we need to have antibiotics. We need more antibiotics. Our arsenal is low. I would say, and the partnerships we have, that is going to be essential as we are continuing. I mean, the WHO has looked at this as a antimicrobial resistant as a major threat. The CDC has listed it as well. But again, it's a different thing other than like a vaccine, right? A vaccine for COVID, you want to give this to everybody. You want to get those arms and all the shots. This, nope. It's a different thought. So I think, having the attention on this and on the different payment models and the different streams is a real opportunity to add antimicrobial resistance and the importance for the development of antibiotics to be part of the conversation. I think with the European Commission just developing their concept last week of HERA, hopefully their complement to the BARDA agency, that is another place where we can have more partnerships and talk about how we can get at this together.
Do you see evidence that this is becoming a priority within the Biden administration? And say a few words about the power and centrality of action in Congress.
I think, it is becoming a priority within the Biden administration. I think it's signaled by, again, action that's occurring with the G7. I think action, again, is, with the Congress introducing multiple legislation, most recently the Pasteur Act. So I think there's a lot of attention here.
Is it a bipartisan consensus? Is this something that has brought people together? I mean, we're in a deeply polarized context right now.
I think this is something that it has always been proposals in Congress and other that has been bipartisan. And I think this is something where we need to stay bipartisan because, as we know, infections do not choose teams here. So they are hitting all of our hospitals and all of our constituents. So I think this is something where we really could come together and advance the ball.
That's very hopeful. In the last few seconds that we have here, about 30 seconds, tell us why we should be optimistic and hopeful in this area. This is a tough area. You've pointed out the intrinsic challenges to it. They're multiple. And it's been a problem. It's taken many people many years to sort of get us to this point. So what gives us the greatest hope and confidence that we're going to be able to make more progress?
I think, Steve, a great question. I am very hopeful. I mean, we are talking about this today. We have attendees there in the room that are ready to be foot soldiers and advocate for this. That action must happen now. And we have partnerships of strange bedfellows that have never been together before talking about these issues. So we are so close, and we just have to keep talking and get past the noise and say that this needs to happen now. And I think we are on the precipice of actually making an impact.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jenelle. And thank you for your leadership in this. And thanks for Merck's leadership in this.
Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it.